My name is Luke Baumgartner. I'm a research fellow at the program on extremism at George Washington University.
Okay, could you begin by telling us about the program that you work for and how it informed and helped you create the piece we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, so the program on extremism was formed in 2015, um, and we are a nonpartisan research organization, independent research organization that is basically dedicated to studying, researching all forms of violent extremism across the political spectrum. And a lot of that research informs policymakers, law enforcement, and people on the front lines and on the ground.
Yeah, we'll be talking about well, thank you for that. Your paper or piece you wrote recently, Where Did All the White People Go? Or Where Did the White People Go? A thematic analysis of terrorist manifestos inspired by replacement theory, which just came out. So, congratulations on this. It's quite a
Thank you.
quite a nice piece of writing. So, if you could tell us basically why you decided to focus on the Great Replacement and how you came to look at the manifestos, and then we'll get into kind of the history of all of it.
Yeah. So I kind of first came across, um, the Great Replacement theory, a couple of years ago, while I was still in grad school. Um, And the school, excuse me, the class was called Race, Religion, and Terrorism. So, of course, we looked at the intersection of all three of those phenomenon. And one of the things that kept coming up during, sort of our week-long, 2 week-long focus on far-right extremism and terrorism and white supremacy was this narrative of population or demographic replacement as a driver for violent extremism. So that was basically what sort of piqued my interest in it because I kept seeing it come up over and over again in some of these examples that we'll get into a little bit later. Um, but one of, the focal points for, you know, a lot of the incidents or at least the violence that we've kind of looked at is replacement theory. And I wrote a couple papers dealing with it tangentially while I was still in grad school. The first one was looking at, what inspired Brenton Tarrant to carry out his attack. It was a fusing of race, religion, and those sort of, grievances, I would say. And the second one where it kind of came up that was at least, present in my mind at that time, um, was Anders Breivik in 2011 in Oslo, Norway. And so those were sort of two of the papers that I used to kind of take a deeper look at it. Excuse me. And while I was in the course of, researching for those papers in school, I noticed that there was a lack of comprehensive literature on the actual theory. People put it together piecemeal and gave a pretty broad overview of it, but there wasn't a more detailed analysis of where the conspiracy sort of came from, how it sort of developed, into these two different, separate yet, similar theories. And like I said, say again, we'll get into the differences. Um, but there was no comprehensive look at how these two separate but somewhat equal theories developed, of course, across time in the United States and in Europe. So that's the gap that I wanted to fill with this, and I wanted to apply it to the context of how it motivated violent extremists.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of those questions that kind of we gloss over when we look at the manifestos because it's just like, oh, everyone thinks they know what the Great Replacement is and kind of where it came from, and I would love for you to define it for us, and you can do the two branches, kind of overlay it now, but because it seems self-evident, but I think when you drill down into it, it becomes a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, so broadly speaking, the Great Replacement theory is a racist and anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that posits that there is a nefarious plan plotted by a cabal of global elites or liberals, which is typically just a euphemism for Jews, that they're ethnically replacing or demographically replacing white people or Europeans, people of European descent, however you kind of want to put that. The main driver behind it is that there is a conspiracy, that there are people behind the scenes who are pulling the strings, who are, making this happen on purpose. And the sole purpose is to completely eliminate any notion of being white or being European. So that's the broad overview of it. And of course, there's differences between the European and American context that we can get into. There's some subtle differences, but that's the main way to look at it.
And when you started to look at it a little bit deeper, you define, well, I guess it's four common themes in the manifesto, but it does define kind of the contours of the Great Replacement as well, because it plays into these four themes. But I don't know if you want to talk about that now, or if you want to go through some of the history of where the idea came from first. Which way I'll
Yeah,
go to back into the information.
yeah. I think it would be helpful for anybody who's listening or watching to kind of go through the history first. Um, and I'll do it in the same way that I did in the paper. So I bifurcated between American and European context because I had this question of, which came first, chicken or the egg? Was it, you know, did this theory originate in the United States? Did it originate in Europe? The modern manifestation of replacement theory did manifest in Europe, but it's sort of rumblings and grumblings had been in the United States for, over a century. Um, so basically, the earliest example that I could find that was reliable, at least, was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically banned Chinese immigrants from coming to the United States out of fears over, scarce opportunities for labor, especially on the railroads, especially in the Western United States and in the, Western quote unquote frontier. Um, that was sort of the first example. There's others that you could look at and probably put into that. A lot of the sort of factors surrounding Bacon's rebellion back in the Revolutionary period was also another thing that kind of came up where white colonialists were concerned about the sort of up and coming African enslaved population in the United States getting more rights, being able to vote, so on and so forth. I'm not a historian, so if I'm doing that disservice, I apologize. But moving on throughout, the 1800s, and we get to 1901, where we have sociologist Edward Ross publish, you know, this term, quote unquote, race suicide. And it was in his most well-known work, The Causes of Race Superiority. And he, sort of was lamenting at the fact that there was greatly increased levels of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and he kind of had this warning to his readers saying that if we don't stop this increased immigration, our race of white Europeans coming from Northern and Western Europe will eventually go extinct. Um, so that was kind of like the first mention of the term race suicide. And that was, Madison Grant sort of picked up the torch with that. And Grant was, this very staunch conservationist. He was a lawyer. He was also a hardcore racist and eugenicist, and basically helped fund and fuel the eugenics movement of, the early 1900s. And so he was very influential in passing legislation that severely restricted immigration. And eventually in 1924, the United States passed, the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which basically halted all immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. And, throughout the time, they instituted quotas of how many people could come from which countries, not just in Europe, but outside of that in Asia and South America, so on and so forth. But the big thing that Grant did, and I think his greatest sort of, you know, achievement or contribution to the theory overall was him publishing The Passing of the Great Race in 1916. And that became a favorite of Teddy Roosevelt, the former United States president. Um, and he had a very similar fear as Ross did just a few years earlier. So I'll read this quote from the book. So this is Grant. Quote, Aboriginal populations from time immemorial have been again and again swamped under floods of newcomers and have disappeared for a time from historic view. In the course of centuries, however, these primitive elements have slowly reasserted their physical type and have gradually bred out their conquerors, so that racial history of Europe has been in the past and is today a story of the repression and resurgence of ancient races. So, Grant is basically saying the exact same thing as Ross is, increased levels of immigration, less white people. It's this, campaign against race mixing. Um, and then, George Lincoln Rockwell in the 60s sort of picked that back up because you have to remember that during the 1930s and 1940s, during the Second World War, eugenics and National Socialism or fascism kind of fell out of favor with a lot of the American public, save for a few, notables here and there, Henry Ford and the like. But George Lincoln Rockwell picked that up back in the 60s. So, real briefly, Rockwell was the founder and leader of the American Nazi Party. Um, and he, published a lot of, vitriolic sort of racism and anti-Semitism in his book and in his magazines. And he basically went on to say that World War II and the Civil War were these quote unquote brother wars between white people. World War II was a brother war between all the whites in Europe, and the Civil War was this brother war between white Americans in the United States. And, that's basically where, the idea of race suicide sort of comes from. And how it differs from sort of white genocide, which is the same side of the coin, is that the burden of responsibility for who's facilitating this falls on different shoulders. So when it comes to race suicide, we think of suicide, outside of this racial context, of being self-inflicted. And when it comes to the idea of racial suicide, it is, white people themselves that are inflicting this upon them by letting immigrants come in and, intermarrying with different, races or other ethnicities. So that's where the burden of responsibility falls. But when it comes to white genocide, it is planned. And that shift to the idea of white genocide didn't really come about until the 1970s and the 1980s, really. And David Lane, and David Duke, two Davids, were very instrumental in sort of facilitating this idea of white genocide. And David Lane was the first one to actually coin the term in his 88 Precepts, which he published while he was in prison. I think it was in 1999. And within this book is basically a compilation of all of his writings while he was locked up. And the essay, which is called the White Genocide Manifesto, was the first time that he really introduced the idea that there is a global cabal of Jewish liberal elites that are organizing increased levels of immigration to the United States. And now, at this point, even in the 70s and 80s, there had been increased levels of, immigration from Central and South America. As I'm sure some of your listeners might be familiar with, there are a ton of, civil conflicts and foreign intervention in Central and South America at the time. So, of course, um, people are going to flee those conflict areas and look for safer refuge. And they found it in the United States. Pat Buchanan was a huge, sort of driver of anti-Latino immigration in the United States. And him and David Lane and David Duke were the ones who really sort of popularized and sort of fused the ideas of race suicide and white genocide in the United States. And that's a long way of kind of explaining how white genocide became the preeminent sort of sub theory of Great Replacement in the United States, at least.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to just not drill down, but maybe stress again the difference between the two, because in listening to you explain it, it sounds also that the immigrants that were coming over for race suicide were in and of themselves white, but they weren't seen as white, correct?
No, correct. Yeah. I mean, Italians weren't considered white. Irish weren't considered white for a very long time. Of course, you had large numbers of Jewish immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe as well. They weren't considered white either, at least, by Nordic or Northern European standards. So, of course, there was this sort of debate over who exactly qualifies as white during that time, and that's still a debate that's prevalent among, far right neo-Nazis today.
Right. And then the second not race suicide, the genocide is when it's actually brown and people of color coming over, correct? So it's
Correct. Yeah.
and that would be the difference. And the gentleman we talked about, I use that term loosely, the Duke and Lane and Pat Buchanan, who I try to forget about. He they specifically turned it into like a clan-based hate of blacks, Jews, and other Hispanics and other people like that, correct?
Yes, and they did that by basically insinuating that blacks, Jews, Hispanics, any other, racial ethnic minority, were the pawns of Jews. Specifically, blacks and Latinos were the pawns of Jews in this, global plot to eliminate white people.
Yeah, that's I remember when that was on Geraldo or something when they were talking about that idiocy. So let's talk about Europe because and I think we probably need to talk about Pierce's book as well when we start talking about the different books that have come out and how Europe contributes to, but also kind of twists this idea of great replacement.
Yes. Um, so in Europe, um, the stage is basically set in the post-war, post-Second World War era, during the time of decolonization. So France, Britain, they were giving up their colonies. They were facing massive resistance from the native populations, France and Algeria, uh, Britain and India. And so, of course, with decolonization comes a lot of civil conflict, a lot of civil strife. And similar to what we saw in Central and South America, um, these populations, eventually ended up fleeing to their one-time colonizers. So a lot of Indians and Pakistanis went to, or what would become Pakistan, fled to the UK and Britain, and a lot of Algerians fled to France. Algeria was considered, part of France at least during that time. So they retained some semblance of French citizenship. So as these, non-white, non-Christian populations started coming into, traditionally white and European countries, um, people took notice. And it really started to take off in France, really. Um, so you had what was called the Nouvelle Droite, or the ND, or the New Right, in France that basically emerged in the 1960s. And it was this sort of think tank that promoted this new form of conservatism, founded by Alain de Benoit. And what they ended up doing was, they facilitated this reaction against, egalitarian socialist French thought that traditionally permeated French academia for so long. I basically ranted against decadence and Western materialism and everything, and the soft power that the United States sort of exhibited across the rest of the world. Um, and one of the people to come out of that school of thought was Jean Raspail, and he published this book called Camp of the Saints, or Le Camp des Saints, and it's basically the a dystopian fiction novel, that depicts, invasions or hordes of dark-skinned refugees coming from India and eventually overwhelming France, to where these refugees team up with leftists, anarchists, communists, overthrow the French government, and France ceases to be France anymore. Um, and that was, sort of the novel that really sort of set it off in France, and it's become popular amongst other far right figures, Steve Bannon, Jared Taylor, John Tanton, and a few others. But after Jean Raspail, excuse me, you had Renaud Camus, who was this gay French travel writer, who, during the course of his work writing for these travel magazines, in the 1980s and the 1990s, he he had already read, these folks from the New Right, and he was on assignment in Hero in '96, and he saw tons of Muslim women in part of France that he never thought he would see Muslim women in. And this was such a foreign sight to him that it just repulsed him. And from that point on, he sort of noticed that, hey, if this trend keeps continuing, um, then we will end up becoming colonized. And he kind of dubbed this term colonization by belly. And it's basically predicated on this belief that Muslims have higher reproduction rates than non-Muslims. And eventually, the more Muslims that come to France, the more children that they have comparatively to quote unquote native French couples or French people, then eventually they'll be replaced. So, in 2011, that's when Camus published, The Great Replacement, which is basically his magnum opus, basically laying out the entire theory for anybody who would read it.
Yeah, and there's that British guy who I don't know how you pronounce it, but it's like Bat Ewer.
Yeah, Batyor. Yeah.
Bat Ewer. And maybe you could explain that name and why he takes that pseudonym and what his contribution and Fallaci, I guess, as well.
Yes. So Batyor is actually a woman. Yes, she is a British historian who grew up in Egypt. She is, a British Jew who grew up in Egypt. Um, and she sort of came up with, she was, this pseudo historian, conspiracy theorist, who sort of came up with this theory called the Eurabia thesis. And basically, what she lays out in her written works is that in the 1970s there was this European Arab dialogue in the 1970s, where in exchange for better prices on oil, European countries would let higher numbers of Arab and Muslim immigrants into their countries. That forms the basis for it. And Batyor was, really instrumental, especially in the early 2000s, of getting this idea of a conspiracy to the wider masses. And together with, Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci, who, in the wake of, 9/11, really took a hard right Islamophobic turn through her books and her essays, um, basically took what Batyor was saying and supercharged it. And if you read through some of their works, you will find lines that you would think basically came straight out of something from an American neo-Nazi. And it gets really hard to tell the difference between the two. Arguably, they are, you know, more educated and a little bit more eloquent than a lot of American neo-Nazis would be. Batyor likes to use this Islamic concept of dhimmi or dhimmitude, whereby non-Muslims, particularly Jews and Christians, in the 6th and 7th century, were treated in a different way than Muslims were in any sort of Muslim land. So you would have to pay a tax called a jizya tax. You'd pay to the Muslim government in exchange for not being harassed, not being killed, so on and so forth. Um, and basically, what Batyor did was apply that to her conspiracy of the European Arab dialogue. Um, that European countries are basically subservient to these Muslim and Arab countries in exchange for better rates on oil prices. Um, but she greatly misunderstands what the term actually means. And there's, centuries of literature on how Jews, Muslims, and Christians actually interacted in many peaceful, situations in the Middle East, especially when, whether it was underneath the Ottoman Empire or some of the earlier dynasties in the Middle East. But she just totally glosses over that.
Well, that seems a commonality to all of these theories. I mean, going all the way back to race science and eugenics, you just gloss over real science
Exactly.
and all that kind of stuff and make up whatever you want and justify it. But so you've laid the groundwork now for what is the great replacement and kind of how it has these different components. And now you add in manifestos of violent terrorism. And could you explain to us what the terrorists and these people are, how they enact their violence, and then how this theory informs what they do? Because unlike other mass shooters, these guys love to tell us at great length with excruciating detail why they feel compelled to do what they do.
Yeah. Um, so I chose the manifestos for a couple reasons. The first is that, they provide a window into, the attacker's sort of mind, albeit limited and imperfect. Um, you know, During the time that I was actually flipping through these pages, poring over them, highlighting, doing a bunch of control F. Okay, how many times did this term pop up? How many times did that term pop up? How many pages did they devote to this or that? Um, there was a lot of sort of distraction placed in there as well. You have to take these manifestos with a grain of salt when you're looking through them, uh, because that's sort of intentional with what these people do. They leave behind a manifesto, not necessarily for normies, quote unquote, to sort of look to and think, oh wow, that's really messed up. Here's why he did it. These are his exact words, these are his motivations. It's not necessarily always cut and dry like that. A lot of it is shit posting, a lot of it is a distraction or purposely misleading or purposely sarcastic or ironic. And that's sort of the point. But the overall point is for them to leave behind some sort of manual for others to look at. There might be another disaffected young white man who picks up the manual and looks at, or the manifesto, and looks at it and says, you know, this loser in his basement who spent hours and hours online, on Reddit, on 4chan, 8chan, wherever, um, they picked up a rifle and did something about it, so why can't I do it? And that's the main, purpose, at least what I think, excuse me, behind a lot of these manifestos that I examined, especially for this one. Um, and specifically the ones that I chose were the manifestos by Anders Breivik from 2011, his attack in Norway, Brenton Tarrant from his attack in Christchurch, New Zealand in March of 2019. There was also John Earnest, who shot up a mosque in Poway, California in April 2019. And then there was also Patrick Crusius, who shot up a Walmart in El Paso, Texas in August 2019. And then finally Peyton Gendron, who shot up a top supermarket in Buffalo, New York in May of 2022. So those were the 5 manifestos that I picked, basically because it was the best, I use that term loosely, best material to work with, because I actually left behind, something for somebody else to read. And that was their intention, to leave behind a manifesto, inspire others. So that was basically the selection criteria that I used for this one.
And you found some common themes throughout them, and I'd love for you to unpack those in light of what we just talked about with the history.
Yeah. So I found 4 themes, and I'll go through them one by one. Uh, excuse me. So the first theme that I found was that they believe wholeheartedly that non-white immigration poses some sort of existential threat to, American and European culture. Um, so basically, a lot of the theory that underlies this sort of racial anxiety is that transformations in any given country's demographic makeup due to immigration comes at the expense of, domination by another. So traditionally, when you have a country like the United States or a lot of the countries in Western, Central, and even Eastern Europe, um, which are traditionally what we think of as, white places where white people live and where white people are from. Um, so those places are dominated by those cultures and by that dominant, race. And anytime you inject some outsider, foreigner, somebody who isn't in the in group, and it creates some sort of anxiety, and it's a racial anxiety. Um, and the fear is what Dr. Michael Fiola calls melancholic character of white nationalism. Um, it's that not just the the nation of this white space is slipping away, but it belongs to them and it is rightfully theirs. And who are these outsiders to come and take it from us? This is our country. It's not for non-whites. It wasn't founded by non-whites. It's supposed to stay white. And that's a sort of a lot of the fear and anxiety that drives this mobilization to violence. And even more so is what these attackers perceive as a lack of action by the governments that they live under to stop it. So if governments aren't going to clamp down on immigration, specifically non-white immigration, then they see it as their personal duty and responsibility to take matters into their own hands. If we can't vote somebody into office who will do this, if we can't get politicians who are already in office to actually, you know, make the time and effort to pass legislation to enact what we want, then that's on us. The burden is on us now to pick up a rifle, construct a bomb, and send a message. And get all of the quote unquote, invaders out of our traditionally white space and homeland. So that's the first theme. And if you have any questions about the first theme, happy to answer.
Yeah, I think the thing that I would really stress on that, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about, is the emotional kind of, we're losing something that cannot be replaced. So I mean, it's this weird dispossession, right? So can you talk a little bit more about that in this context, where it's, you know, what we have is being given to someone who's lesser than.
Yes, and that's what other political scientists and other social theorists have kind of called, the politics of rage, and that's formed in relative between privileged and non-privileged groups. Um, so there are, according to, those who kind of adhere to this, replacement theory, there are a finite number of resources to go around for everybody. Um, and if the in-group, my group, is accustomed to having the majority of these resources, and people and the out-group comes into our community, therefore, some of those finite resources are being taken away from us. Our piece of the pie is getting smaller, and that elicits, a negative, emotional response because they see this outgroup who is getting their piece of the pie is undeserving. They weren't here when we were here. My family's been here for XYZ number of generations, and you just came off the boat, and now suddenly you get to have all the things that I worked so hard for. And that's really what the driver of that negative emotional response really is. It's this perception of inequality, ironically, inequality, and it's this realization that it's not just me or my in group who's entitled to some of these benefits, it's everybody else too.
The finite resources then lead to theme two, which is access and control of women and
Correct.
misogyny. So
Yes.
tell us about how that twisted logic works.
Yes. So broadly, um, misogyny is the overarching second theme that I identified when I was going through these, manifestos. And when it comes down to it, is this one, concern over modernization and how women fit into broader society. Um, as society progresses, we become more educated and more resilient. Women generally are not at home. They're not raising children. They are out, attaining careers, progressing, getting educated. God forbid, driving and voting too, depending on where you live. And so that is what they see as, sort of the first threat to maintaining white dominance or white superiority. Um, and the second one is just protecting white women in general. So the first prong of this is this overarching desire to return to some sort of bygone era. And typically, what we see with, a lot of the Telegram groups that I lurk in, and a lot of the propaganda that you see from some of these people is, man, they are just really longing to go back to the 1940s and 1950s, when women were at home, men were the primary breadwinners, women raised the children, and all these sorts of, socially constructed, gender roles that were traditionally adhered to. Um, and this is what they refer to as tradition. Everything else is modernity. So they want, the sort of saying within this milieu of far right extremists is embrace tradition, reject modernity. So they want people to embrace this traditional idea of gender roles and traditional lifestyle and reject the sort of, um, you know, broadly amorphous, sort of westernized, globalized culture that's come as a result of, capitalist globalization, intermingling cultures and economies and everything along those lines. Um, and everything is just becoming this gray mass of amorphous, acultural sort of goo, really, where you can't really tell people apart. You can't tell, oh, is he an American? Is he a Canadian? Well, because of America, American culture has been exported all over the world, and no culture is exactly distinct anymore. There's no possibility of maintaining your culture or maintaining our culture. So it's a maintenance issue for them, which is brought about by globalization. And then, secondary to that, but I think is probably the most important, is just this overall desire to become or be this protector of white women. And who are they protecting white women from? Non-white men. So it's something that you see really over and over again when there's fear mongering or panics about immigration. Is won't you think of the poor delicate women or think of the children? Is something that you hear over and over again. And their primary fear is that they have more competition for mating with white women. And these people are afraid that non-white men are going to come and take the white women that are rightfully theirs and they are entitled to and reproduce with and start a family with. And a lot of this comes out of fear that non-white men just can't control themselves around white women. They are sexually aggressive by nature, and these are immutable traits that they just can't shake, and they can't help but to rape white women and create mixed race babies. That's what it comes down to um, in the misogyny aspect of this. So, in their quest for becoming this brave warrior who protects white women, they have to kill all their competition, which are non-white men. And they're protecting the body of white women, and that's literal and figuratively, that the the character of a nation is shaped through a woman's a woman's body. And that is, like I said, physical and literal. Physically, because they are the ones who bear the children, and they're the ones who make white babies. And symbolically, that transfers or, translates into, even if these women are not having children, they could still potentially have children, and therefore they are the future of this nation, of this white nation.
Yeah, and it also denies agency on both fronts. So if women decide to go out and have careers, that's wrong. And then if they decide to go out and have relationships with people who aren't white, that's also wrong. So both of those deny any sort of choice or agency on women. And it's a very, as you say, misogyny is the hatred of women, and this is by protecting, they're also confining and restricting and basically denying autonomy to white women, which is ironic for, in this,
Yeah,
right. So that's
self-defeating, basically.
right. And this is where the incels would fall in. Is that like some of the,
Yeah, there is some overlap there. Um, Incels exhibit, you know, the Venn diagram isn't exactly a circle, but there is, some shared space in between those two.
yeah, okay. Yeah, 'cause I know that's a whole other type of
Can of worms.
manifesto, yeah,
Yeah.
manifesto that they create. So then that brings us to theme three, which is our favorite conspiracy topic, the Jews. And
Correct.
it's
Yeah.
always globalists. It's always, I mean, we hear it. It's amazing how, and I think you talked about it in this section, how mainstreamed this has become. It's at various points in our history, we've had hints of this, but now it's almost, I mean, you just hear it on every news channel.
Yeah. So, you know, for everybody that I kind of looked at in this study, they all shared this, conspiratorial worldview that there is somebody has to be pulling the strings. Somebody is the puppet master. Why is this happening? Well, it's either one of two things. It's either this cabal of liberal elites who adhere to this, quote unquote cultural Marxism ideology, or two, it's the Jews. And that Venn diagram is almost a circle. Um, that one shares like a 98% overlap that I've sort of noticed, and this is just kind of me riffing, but um, you know, whether or not these attackers explicitly refer to Jews as the masterminds behind this conspiracy, it's hit or miss. When I was looking at these manifestos, the only two that I saw that explicitly made a reference to Jews as the puppet masters were John Ernest and Peyton Gendron. So Ernest was the most forward in his, Jew hatred. That was basically the entirety of the 6 pages that he wrote. It was just this railing screed against Jews, and they're responsible for everything that's bad, including, white genocide or ethnic replacement of Europeans. When I looked at Gendron's, his was a little different. His was mainly plagiarized from Brent and Terrence. That's another thing that a lot of these people have in common is that they plagiarize off one another. Um, so I would say probably 80% of Gendron's is just plagiarized from Brent and Terrence. Um, but a difference that I saw between Gendron's and Terrence was that um, Tarrant never explicitly said that he hates Jewish people or he thinks that they are explicitly responsible for the Great Replacement. He sort of alludes to it in his Q&A section, but it's sort of fuzzy. If you're taking it at face value, it's a little fuzzy. If you read between the lines, you can kind of see it. But with Gendron, he dedicates a full 30 pages to just going on about the Jews, and the section is called "About the Jews." Um, so he spends 30 whole pages going through this racial science about how Jews had different genes, yada yada yada, Khazar theory, so on and so forth. And he does explicitly blame Jews for, you know, being behind this calamity, racial calamity that he's attempting to stop. But the others that I looked at were not so, you know, out and out about it. Like I already mentioned, Tarrant was not super anti-Semitic in his manifesto, at least. But if you look through some of his old online footprints, you can see a lot of that. Um, Breivik was not either. He was very much pro-Israel, very much a Zionist, at least at that time. He has since very much changed his tune and become a full-blown neo-Nazi National Socialist while he's been in Norwegian prison. And Crucius doesn't mention Jews at all. Um, so it really sort of varies. But the biggest targets that a lot of and like I said, the overall theme is that there is this cabal of cultural Marxist liberal elites. Um, Whether or not they chalk it up to Jews as being those people depends on the manifesto that you look at.
Yeah, and I mean, when you had people like Glenn Beck getting fired for bringing on a Holocaust denier, and Tucker Carlson basically trotting these global, and Alex Jones, I mean, the globalists don't always mean the Jews, but they always mean the Jews, right?
It's globalist, bankers, liberal elites, any sort of euphemism that you can find. ZOG, Zion Occupied Government, that's another one that comes up a lot. Um, Specifically with Tucker Carlson. New York Times did a project or investigation on him, and over the course of however many years, and thousands of episodes that Tucker Carlson had while he was on Fox News, he mentioned some sort of replacement more than 400 times. Um, so it helps, an outsider looking in to think, if I'm exposed to that, if I tune into Tucker Carlson every night on Fox, or I used to tune into Tucker Carlson every night on Fox, same time slot, and I hear this 400 times, how likely would someone be to end up believing that? If you hear it from talking head on the news, hey, he got that job because he must be qualified to give the news, then, you kind of fall into this fallacy of, um, you know, just sort of submitting to authority.
Well, and submitting to authority brings us to theme four, which is this weird confluence of religion, ethno-state, racial war, holy war against Islam, against Judaism, against. So this sounds like the catch-all. A little bit of the whatever is left kind of gets swept up in this slush
Yeah.
form. Could you kind of walk us through what this means?
Yeah, so this was sort of the theme that I was able to kind of pack a couple more things into. One, kind of for the sake of brevity, and two, just because I don't think it's explored enough, especially in the literature that's out there right now, um, is that the underlying motivation for these attacks is hoping to spark a broader racial war. Um, excuse me. So what the attackers want to inspire others to take up arms, and eventually it cascades, and you have all these white people taking up arms against non-whites, and you get to this quote unquote day of the rope that was in the Turner Diaries, which is William Luther Pierce's dystopian novel from 1978, that has inspired dozens of murders and killed hundreds of people, basically. It's one of the most, deadly sort of books out there, if you want to classify it as such. Um, but what we kind of see throughout the manifestos and throughout the pages is this desire for a racial holy war, or RAHOA. And that term, RAHOA, was popularized by Ben Klassen. Klassen founded, the Church of the Creator, which is now the World Church of the Creator. I don't know. It's gone through a couple different iterations. Anyway, so Ben Klassen basically came up with this idea of a non-theistic religion that eschewed all the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, um, that put race above all. That race is my religion. Um, it's not exactly like super mystical. It's semi-occulty. They use runes and all that sort of thing. Um, but Klassen's conception of RAHOA was, inherently violent and anti-democratic. And he thought it was the destiny of white people to inhabit all the places on Earth, and that white people should pursue this goal of settlement into every territory where non-whites are, and put whites there instead. Um, and that's, sort of what inspired a lot of other white supremacists and white nationalists for generations. Um, and that, I think, that was most well embodied, um, in David Lane. And David Lane was the man who coined the 14 words while he was in prison. The man we talked about earlier. Um, I won't repeat the 14 words, but if you know him, then you know him. Um, so embodied within those 14 words is that call to action for racial holy war, basically. If you look further enough in between the lines, you can find a justification for violence there. Um, and there's plenty of other groups or individuals who have taken that to heart. In the paper, I mentioned Adam Waffen division. I mentioned the base. I mentioned a couple of other, white supremacist terrorists who have really wanted to take this to its extreme end and to its literal end. And that's what their overarching goal is. It's just uh, all out destruction and, um, what Richard Spencer said back during the day of the alt-right heyday, um, a quote unquote peaceful ethnic cleansing. Um, Tangentially, sort of Rahowa, but these guys kind of take that to the max.
Yeah, and maybe well, thank you, because that kind of wraps up the themes in them. Now, could you give us a little bit, because it's not in the paper, so I'm going to ask you to kind of riff a little bit here. But based on
Yeah.
because when you were talking about it earlier, do the manifestos have a structure? Like you said, one had a Q&A section. That just strikes me
Hmm.
as incredibly odd. And like, why would it have a FAQ page on a terrorist document, you know? So could you tell us about the manifestos themselves, how they're kind of written, the language that's used, and then also is there this cheeky kind of modern sense of, am I a Nazi? Maybe I'm a Nazi, that kind of joking 4chan kind of,
Irony.
yeah, or yeah,
Yeah.
racist irony, I guess it is.
Yeah. So I'll address the first point. There is no overarching sort of structure to a lot of these. Um, so Brevik's is 1,500 pages, longer than 1,500 pages. He called it a compendium, which it basically is. Um, and there are people out there who have done far more research into just Breivik's manifesto than I have. Um, but if you look at the bulk of Breivik's manifesto, a lot of it is just straight lifted from other racist far right bloggers that he really liked. One in particular, and he basically just copied entire sections of books, entire sections of blog posts that he liked. Um, and when you eventually do get to the parts that he actually wrote, it's just like incomprehend. It's you can't really wrap your head around it because it is just so pie in the sky that you think a crazy man wrote this. He's hallucinating. Um, that's to say nothing of his, mental health situation. I don't know. I'm not the shrink who interviewed Anders Breivik. But if you're an outsider and you were to read this, if you're not me who spends most of their time reading terrorist manifestos for a living, then you would see this, you would read this and think, what the hell am I reading? Um, but it's one of those you kind of have to know sort of things. Um, but Breivik's was probably the most detailed and meticulously written and compiled. And if you take what he says at face value, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, if you take what he says at face value in the manifesto, he spent, years, multiple years writing that compendium. He spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to write this. And I think he gets that figure from, he does explicitly say that he basically, quit his job. He had lost wages as a result of that to write this manifesto, and of course all the materials that he had to procure, um, and to get the farm to build his bomb and the van to put the bomb in. So if you figure all that in, beyond the point, um, he has instructions where he meticulously lays out the process that he went through for constructing his explosive device and how he procured all of his weapons. And the last, like, 30, 40-ish pages are just this, like, detailed diary of the last 82 days of his life up until, he committed the attack. Spoiler for anybody who doesn't know, he lived through the attack. He was taken by police. So that is sort of a glimpse into him as a person. He goes through his childhood. He has this multiple long Q&A sections, And that's something that a lot of the other attackers that I chose for this paper ended up emulating was this Q&A section. Save for, well, no, actually all of them had some form of that. Not as detailed and not as meticulous as Breivik was, but they did kind of write in this back and forth question and answer, hypothetical question and answer format. And all these manifestos vary in length. Terrence was like 78 or 80-ish pages. Crucius was only like two or three. And Gendron's was 180, but most of that was, again, lifted from Brent and Tarrant. Um, so, they vary in length, they vary in detail, they vary in their level of disgusting things that you have to read for this, field of research. So there is no cookie cutter sort of template for these manifestos, but they do all exhibit some similar symptoms.
I mean, it's just an interesting aside, I suppose, to try to figure out how these things are constructed over time. So, in the end, what are we up against? What can we do? What is the conclusion that we can draw from this? And where are we now?
Um, so manifestos aren't going anywhere, um, as a tool of propaganda and recruitment, basically. Um, if you look at the recent arrests of people who were involved with the Telegram Collective, um, they basically trade manifestos back and forth as currency, like trading cards for Pokemon, sports, what have you. Um, and that's sort of, an implicit requirement for becoming a saint of the Telegram Collective and becoming, martyrized by these folks. Um, is that there is some sort of artifact that's left behind. And even if they don't write a manifesto, it's the potential, or at least the actual act of live streaming your attack, which gains you a lot of, brownie points with these people. Tarrant was the guy who revolutionized that. Gendron did that too. The attacker in Halle, Germany, did that as well. And there's been other people who have at least tried to do it, but have failed. So even if they don't have a written product to leave behind, they could have, a piece of multimedia that could get passed around forever. Um, and if a couple clicks of your mouse and a couple Google searches, you can find all these manifestos at, pretty much anywhere. Um, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges that you face, at least in the United States. It's not illegal to possess these, manifestos. If it was, then I'd probably be in jail because I have so many of them. Um, but right after the Christchurch shooting in March 2019, the New Zealand government made it illegal to possess Brent Tarrant's manifesto, and they've prosecuted quite a few people for that crime. Some people have faced jail and gone to jail for it. Um, I'm not a lawmaker. I'm not a lawyer by training, so I can't say whether or not that is effective. Um, but it's mostly incumbent on the media companies and the social media platforms and the tech companies to do their part in moderation when it comes to content like this. Um, and short of any legislative prerogative to actually get their ass in gear and take it seriously, there won't be much progress made on that front. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I try to be, pragmatic with this at least. They will place maximizing shareholder value over public safety, 99 times out of 100, unless you get that one really genuinely good-hearted mid-level manager who ends up testifying before Congress and becoming a whistleblower every once in a while, like you see with the Facebook every couple of years, then that's really your only recourse at this point. I know that's probably not the answer that a lot of your listeners or viewers wanted to hear, but that's the way that I see it. They might be a little more optimistic than I am, but having interacted with this, you know, for years now, you become a little jaded with it.
Yeah, and it just seems to be the rhetoric and the ideas and all that stuff is out there. And I mean, I guess if you want to use AI as a test case, the Gronk becoming a Nazi within what, a week or something, or a couple days after it being launched, and it's pulling from the web. So all this stuff is just that garbage is just out there for it to absorb, and there's not much we can do about it, unfortunately, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's one of the emerging trends that'll be increasingly more difficult to get in front of.